Hello, thank you very much for tuning into the Paralus community call today. And today is April 30th, and this is the monthly Paralus call happening today. And let me give a brief intro about myself. I am the Developer Relations Manager at Rafay Systems, and I'm the core maintainer of the Paralus open source project. And today we're discussing some very important topic today. So let's just set the agenda first before when I start introducing my guest. So we all know developers are often forced to work on repetitive things whenever they start developing a new service or an application. Repetitive tasks may include creating a boilerplate code, template for a new service that already exists, setting up test bed, spinning up dev test environment. And if your Kubernetes journey started with a handful of team members and small cluster consisting of only a few nodes, you might not have a systematic approach to authorization yet. Perhaps even you granted everyone on your team a cluster admin permissions to keep management simple. Joining me today on April Paralus community call, Valley Shaw, on this topic, how to secure an Amazon EKS cluster with IAM and RBAC, and what step needed to be taken in order to list your project into AWS Marketplace. Welcome, very warm welcome, Valley, for joining us today on the Paralus community call.
Hey, Simon, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate the time in here and super excited. Great community to be in. I look forward to learn a couple of new things as well.
Thank you very much, Valley. And can you introduce yourself a little bit about what you're doing in the AWS as of today? And then we start the agenda.
Yeah. As Simon introduced me, my name is Welly Xiao. I work in AWS as a principal partner solution architect. So what do I do? I work with a lot of partners in co-build and co-innovation strategy, looking around the corner, kind of try to find a new innovations that will delight our customers, of course. Outside of my job, I have a lot of interest in serverless and ML space itself. And I'm also part of the AWS technical field community. So some of other focus such as governance at scale, builder experience, and also open source. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you very much, Shaw, for Valley for the introduction. So let's start. I will start sharing my screen as well, but let's start. Well, can you share your experience of working with EKS customers, and what are the most often challenge you keep on answering as of today?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think security is always the first topic that come up in a lot of the conversations. And it may be because of the gravity of my focus area that I mentioned earlier around management and governance. And you kind of look at Kubernetes, which has since grown in feature and capabilities thanks to the amazing community. Of course, I just read the release of the 26th release yesterday. And if I remember, like early days, I started installing Kubernetes from scratch. And now that's even before EKS existed. But now there's a lot of tool and capabilities that's available to really help customers to speed up their developments. Now, I want to say that if you ask me over the last 12 months, for example, my other focus area has been access control to Kubernetes. We did a couple of talks at Reinforce and reInvent about this. A lot of customers like the powerful feature of Kubernetes, but they don't want to burden their developers on terms like responsibility, managing access control, role permissions, and etc. Just like what you say, Sam. Um, so as I said, like at the past reInvent and Reinforce, we deliver a builder sessions about EKS security and governance at scale. And a lot of customers are actually surprised in terms like some of the tricks and mechanisms that they can leverage to help their developers. Things such as self-service concept, role federations, and more. So I think that's like the key area I would say that has been a challenge with a lot of customers that they know the building block, but then how can they actually use that and then automate a lot of that process?
Yes, absolutely. That's make totally sense to me now. And anybody who joined watching us today on the live chat. You can throw your question on the chat, and we'll put those to the Shaw Valley to answer those as well during the discussion. So, well, we have discussed about what the different challenges you have actually tried to answering as of today. Well, we know not every user need unrestricted ability to create, modify, and delete resources in Kubernetes cluster. How this RBAC system is different from IAM in AWS, and how to apply the existing knowledge of IAM with RBAC.
Oh wow, this is Sam. You know this can be a whole day topic, right? If you really want to sit together and talk about this, but let me try to address it on two sides. Um, let's start with IAM. Like it's pretty much everything you do in AWS, you have to authenticate. That's the whole idea with that. Either you're going through CLI, you do it on console, and API, SDKs, you have to authenticate. So if you are accessing, for example, an S3 bucket in AWS, you as either as a person or as a container running on Kubernetes, you have to have credential. Now, what's really relevant just for this part of the conversation is about like principal and the permissions. Principal can be a person, can be a role, can be a third party identity source as well. And if you kind of park that idea for a second and kind of shift to Kubernetes, there's also a concept of identity, right, in Kubernetes itself. So that could be users or service account. Now, what a lot of people, for example, don't know is that, for example, using IAM as the identity provider, you can assign Kubernetes service account with permissions, basically to assume an IAM role. And then what that means is that your pod can access the S3 bucket, for example, and using the given permission of the IAM role. So we call this concept as the IAM role for service account, or URSA. This is the part like I talk a lot with the folks at reInvent and Reinforce. A lot of people like, oh, don't know they can do that, and on how or exactly how they can use it. So really, the concept is not new. It's just like I like to bring it out first. Now, take a step back. On the other side, if you're an engineer, DevOps, for example, and you also need to access Kubernetes resources. So earlier we're talking about AWS resources. Now shifting to Kubernetes resources, you probably want to do that for troubleshooting, like some deployments. Ideally, you don't do deployment manually; you do it through CI/CD pipeline. But sometimes you have to break fix and etc. and other management activities, right? What you can do also is that using your existing IAM credential and use it to actually authenticate to Kubernetes. So this is again, it's not a new concept. It's the IAM authenticator for Kubernetes, right? So you at high level you map your AWS authentications to the config map, and then you specify the role and what Kubernetes role that you want to assign. So you can tie them both together, and it's highly recommended as the best practice, I would say, because you can reduce the number of like identity that you have to manage on both sides, right? So I think to me that's really the kind of like the gist of connection between IAM and RBAC, and how as a customer you have to kind of think about how you reduce your surface areas in regards to security.
Thanks very much for the wonderful explanation. I think people who are listening or watching to us, they get an idea about this in this as well. So I think for the crux of this whole story is like not every user need unrestricted ability to create, delete, or modify resources. And if there is unrestricted 90% of the time, you are actually battling with troubleshooting tools to learn who does what and when. And as the number of clusters, nodes, applications, and team members increases, you will want to limit the resources your team members and application can access, as well as the action they can take. The role based access control frameworks in Kubernetes allow you to do just that. For example, it can help to ensure that developer only deploy certain apps to a given namespace, or that your infrastructure management team have view only access for monitoring tasks. So that is the story of how RBAC works in Kubernetes. So, well, can you share some of the best practices you have noticed while talking to different AWS partners? You have seen them implemented in their enterprise offering while enabling self-service capabilities to dev teams around access management.
Yeah, Sam, I think you hit the nail when you say self-service. I'll give you a background. A lot of my conversation with the customers started with idea like this. Hey, I want to build this mechanism to allow my developers build faster, deploy faster. But really here the focus on that faster, I think is a lot of times skewed towards like code and binary that runs in the pipelines, right? Actually, the actual application itself. But to your point, like if you take a step back and you really look at the surrounding infrastructures and workflow, that also need to run faster. And not only faster, you have to run safer, right? To your point, like why we why we give 90% of like a surface area for permissions that you don't need, right? How you actually think about that, right? So when you have a new developers or new team coming in, how fast they can onboard and start working is one key, but how fast and safer they can go and onboard is the key, right? So think about AWS accounts, Kubernetes cluster, setup, permission to repo, for example, the permissions for the Kubernetes cluster itself. So I always like to challenge my customers and think about this mechanism as a product because it is a product because they are selling this to their internal customers or the developers, right? So if your internal customer found that, hey, your product is hard to use, your system is hard to use, they likely will take a shortcut, create a shadow IT, increase the blind spot on your overall governance. That's why I think self-service mechanism is the key in here when you talk about best practices. Like the tool is out there, right? But really how you piece it together so that you have this nice self-service model that your developer can use essentially.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And that is actually where the industry is actually also heading to as well. And I think if you look at the, we talk about the self-service, and here is a developer story. Let's say I created a namespace, then I deploy an Argo CD for GitOps, and then I deploy apps. And day 02, use existing namespace, reduce image size, secure base images, installing scanners, deployed policy engine, install service mesh. It's too complicated. Use another one. Uninstall existing service mesh. Oh ho, my app was accidentally broken. Policy engine is deleted. Oh, let's enforce policy. The DevOps team created a namespace. Dev, please give me access. Access is granted. Argo CD deployed, app deployed. I need a service mesh. DevOps team, please give me access to infra namespace. Access granted. Installed is still installed. Already app running is broken. DevOps team, please create a rule next time that I can only access a can view a namespace and that don't belong and nothing and do nothing else. DevOps, what happened to the existing feature? Dev team, it's broken. Why? A new member joined the team and accidentally broke the Argo CD deployment. Dev team, please create a rule that says John can only view resources in the namespace and do nothing else. That's where the need for the Paralus and the self service is come very shiny. So Paralus is as we give you the secure kubectl access to remote cluster from anywhere with just-in-time service account creation and user level credential management with your organization RBAC and SSO. Now I go to that valley after telling you this story of dev versus ops story of day 01 and day 02. Valley, now I have two questions for you. Number one, since you have spent good amount of time parallels on the AWS Marketplace side, while helping customers and partner, if the Paralus is actually available as a one-click installer on AWS Marketplace, what do you think Paralus can be shine in this domain and how it can become a game changer for platform and DevOps team?
Yeah, I think coming back, I think the whole idea, and I feel like that's gonna be the theme of today conversation. Same, is it about the self-service model? And if you look at AWS Marketplace, it's really meant for that. It's meant for you to have collection of software that has been vetted by the AWS, of course. We work with a lot of our partners. And then we present it in the way that you can self-service the installations and the procurement of the software. But it's also including open source and free services as well, right? So if you are able to build that mechanisms in the front within the marketplace, there's a way for you, for example, to specify like a private registry in the marketplace. And then you can use that, for example, to present a list of approved software in your customers, right? So that's going to help them to procure that. What you see the same in the screen right now is kind of some of that mechanism for you to be the one who publish that, right? But if you're kind of just looking from the end user perspective, I think that's going to be a game changer because one, you let them self-service the way to get Paralus installed, and then the next part would be just to kind of present the Paralus user interface itself, right, to those developers essentially. So then they can go in and say select the cluster and then specify the permissions that they want, and ideally have like a list of roles and permissions kind of presented for them. So then you can look at it from holistically as an organizations. Which I want to interject a new idea as well. It's called the data boundary. Typically, what we call it is like how you as an organization think about your data boundary. Like this is a cluster, for example. What namespaces that a team belongs to, what they can do in that namespaces, and things around like types of data that they can bring to the namespaces. And alongside with that, you can define what kind of permission someone needs to have on that particular cluster. I think that's definitely will be a very delightful experience. If you can quickly install that as well, right? The other angle, for example, if you look at EKS, EKS has this concept of add-ons, for example. I think that's something we have to explore as well, is that you have your Paralus listed in the AWS Marketplace. I hope that we can see that in the upcoming days or weeks. And then you can add it into EKS as an add-on, right? There is the whole idea of like a Kubernetes blueprint, EKS Kubernetes blueprints using Terraform, for example. And then you can just, with a single line of code, you can have Paralus loaded up as part of your cluster deployment. And then you use that to basically, essentially kind of bootstrap that actual cluster itself with Paralus. I think there's a lot of cool concept that we can do as soon as we start to see the actual product listing in the marketplace.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And while I'm sharing my screen, I think it's a good time to ask you the same question around the line. Like, I work with the various open source projects and communities globally throughout the world. There are a number of open source projects. They're looking at the way how we can be listing in the marketplace. So, can you give us a walkthrough if some open source project wanted to be in the marketplace? What should they have been done?
Yeah. Perhaps the audience might not be aware of what is AWS Marketplace. So let's start with that first. I know we talked a little bit about that, but AWS Marketplace is this place where you, as a customer, you can find, test, also purchase, or use software and services that has been validated to run on AWS. So this is ranging from AMI, like Amazon Machine Image install-based software, container image, such as like Paralus, for example. You can also purchase or procure data, professional services as well, and also like a SaaS services. So for the customers, the AWS Marketplace really brings that benefit of like a wide variety of selections of AWS partners. But the actual benefit is on also the streamline of the procurement. So that's including procurement of free software and services. And this is why AWS Marketplace has this standardized license term, which means that when you introduce your software or your solutions to an organization, for example, they can use that existing standard contract in the marketplace. And for customers that want to innovate faster, this is actually a great way to accelerate. Why? Because you have that single contract. So you're not looking at multiple types of contracts, multiple types of agreements, and etc. Right? And also you have a single combined billing. So when you purchase a product to marketplace, all of the usage for that particular product can be aggregated into the actual AWS billing. So again, you only have one invoices to deal with, and you don't have to deal with a lot of vendor. Okay, so that's a little bit about um, the marketplace. And Sam, if you come back to that diagram that you have earlier, um, there's a couple steps that you can do to list your product into to the marketplace, right? So you start with like having access to the management portal. You need to submit your product, then upload it into the container registry, and through that process itself, there are a lot of check and safety mechanism to ensure that your product follow the best practice. So here you can see in the screen, right? You first register as the seller, as AWS Marketplace seller, then you submit your product, you go through the review process. This is when we kind of look at all of the like attributes about your product, and then you actually develop and push those container images into the registry within the AWS Marketplace. You can also integrate with the Marketplace API if you have to do like a billing and mentoring and stuff like that. Not always have to be relevant, but it's there if you need it. And then once it's available, you basically publish it as a product in the marketplace. Then from there on, community can start using it. And if you have any new updates, you can go through the whole process as well. There's also an API driven way for you to say like pull from your pipelines and publish it into a new container image. Um, so I know I talk a lot about that, but this is a good way if you want to kind of position your open source project, for example, right? Because you get the benefit of using marketplace and capture the audience on the marketplace, but you also provide them with the benefits such as this standard license term agreement, and also maybe not very relevant for open source, but there's also like a streamline of the billing process that the company or the organization can see all of the open source project that they're using in the marketplace, and they can also allow list it to you if needed.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And that's a very needed walkthrough that customer needed to be understand. And I think the number one story behind the marketplace that I like about it is once your project is listed in the marketplace, behind the scene, the AWS team is actually making sure that it's actually running, have been battle tested for the production environment, and you don't need to worry about. If you clone this project manually, it's take a lot of time. You set it up using Helm chart, then you push the images into your the container registry that is actually closer to you, the organizations you have set up. But I know there's a lot of customer who are already using ECR that is already been available. So just a click installer. So that's a wonderful way of using the open source project. And I think that gives you a very less time to for think about all these kind of things. So we know we talk about marketplace, we talk about Paralus. So I think that Paralus is actually the simplified. I think the benefit of implementing RBAC is that it gives you this simplified RBAC strategy that reduces the amount of manual effort associated with creating individual roles and modifying them whenever the user access need changes. Instead, admin can create and administer a core set of role and use them to manage to access of multiple users. Unfortunately, this approach won't completely eliminate manual effort. Admin might still need to create custom roles or an individual basis when the generic role binding based on user type do not fit the need for an individual user, and you will still lack visibility into your configuration and user permissions. So one of the slide I've created is give you the walkthrough of like this one is give you the walkthrough of how the complex it is when you try to do it in the manually. So manage Kubernetes RBAC with tools and template. And one of the tool is Paralus. There are multiple more available on the internet. But the Paralus is offered a centralized and automated way to manage Kubernetes RBAC. It gives you the ability to create a custom roles, users, and groups, a dynamic and immediate changing and revoking of permissions, seamless integration with IDPs such as Google, GitHub, Google, Azure, and Octane, and automatic logging of all user action performed for audit and compliance purposes. And if somebody created a cluster, well, let's say right now, Parallels lock this activity and give you the time when this actually happened. So before we wrapping up today's call, Valley, any pointers on where do you think EKS and Kubernetes ecosystem will move for next few months? Any recommendation? What could be effective strategy to be looked for enterprise adoption of Kubernetes and managed services?
Oh wow, yeah, that's a one loaded question right there. Same. I think if all of us have a crystal ball, I think we probably know the answers. But uh, I think this is just for my solely my personal view. Um, if you remember the first time Kubernetes was introduced, the whole idea is about developers to deploy their application, not worrying about infrastructure provisioning, the VM network, VPC for that matters. And for sometimes I think that's true, and I've seen like a lot of great success from the early adopter of this model. And over time, you see additional feature capabilities are added thanks to the extensibility of Kubernetes. To me personally, one have to ask these questions: am I moving faster by using Kubernetes as my platform? If the answer is not, then we have to ask why. What do I do wrong? How other that has been successful in their adoptions, and what kind of tools, process that they put in place, right? For example, any new developers that use Kubernetes today, like maybe just straight graduated from the college, likely they don't understand how the TCP/IP packets move around between the container, node proxy, Kubernetes proxy, all of that, all the way to the exit of the VPC. And if they really dive deeper to that, they might get spooky because how peculiar this traffic actually works, right? But that's fine because the whole sole reason of that they didn't need to know about it is because we have successfully encapsulated a lot of that work, a lot of that complexity. And I think this same thing applies to also compute. For example, you don't have to care about 4 cores, 2 sockets, 1 core, 1 socket, and etc. So to me, I think if an organization is able to provide this kind of like self-service model on top of Kubernetes, they will be the one that gain the most benefit of it. And when I say they, I mean like their users, their developers, for example. So any engineering investment on self-service model itself is not small. I realize that, um, but I really look forward to see like more of open source projects such as Paralus that really help to solve this at scale. So I think that's what a lot of enterprises have to kind of look at when they look into adopting Kubernetes at scale.
Absolutely. That's a very wonderful point to wrap up this call as well. And also, I think on topic of the Kubernetes and the abstraction, I think we have reached a point where the adoption and the understanding of Kubernetes and Kubernetes tool are mature enough to start hiding them away from the team consuming them. So I think that is a need necessity now. People think about their apps, the business they're running on their apps, not how the Kubernetes work behind the scene to how they spin a pod, deployment, replica set. That is a job of somebody else who knows Kubernetes very well and that has managed solution on the cloud. And EKS is the most adopted one as of today and the largest cloud provider in the services. And when you start using them, you might need one team, actually 10 teams are using the same EKS cluster and you give them a role like you can do this, you can do that, but you cannot pollute what others works as well. And that where humans are not good enough. They need a tool, they need some kind of tooling that help them, and one of those tool is Paralus that give you the access, the only things that it needed for you to have your job done. So with that, I'm really thankful for our AWS partner, AWS Avali Shaw, to helping us understand the very important topic before we go to the KubeCon. If you are going to the KubeCon, I think this is the most important talk for you because you want to understand the needs of enterprises and the Kubernetes and the open source and the AWS and the marketplace. So thank you very much again, Valley. Number one
Yeah,
for the
thank you.
wonderful overview of the marketplace. I think this helped a lot of the open source project diagram. I will share with the people as well if they want to see how things works. And with that, thank you very much for tuning to this episode. And we will be meeting again next week for the Paralus Office Hour with one of the core maintainers of the Paralus open source project with Atul Priya Sharma. With that, thank you very much, Wally, once again. We'll be meeting again in future. Stay happy, stay healthy. Bye bye, everyone.
Take care.